Buongiorno a tutti, benvenuti ad EX ASTRIS SCIENTIA, convegno organizzato dall'Associazione Culturale Mediocielo e coordinato da Antonella Magretti e Rocco Pinneri. Intanto rivolgo un saluto a Ilaria Brianti, traduttrice, parte del nostro team. Buongiorno Ilaria.
Ciao Sergio, buongiorno.
E ovviamente passo un attimo a salutare l'ospite di oggi, appunto l'astrologo Glenn Perry. Good morning, Mr. Perry, how do you do?
Good morning. Very well, thanks.
Is it 9 a.m.? What time zone are you in?
East Coast, Eastern Daylight Time in America. And yes, it's 9 o'clock.
Good job. So, let us begin. Ilaria, you're going to start this interview. I might interfere later on.
Ok, grazie Sergio e dopo questa presentazione, welcome to Mr. Perry, a licensed psychotherapist and astrologer since 1975. Thank you for having accepted our invitation to this interview, and it is a real pleasure to have you with us today.
Likewise.
Thank you. To begin with, here is a very simple and yet difficult question at one time, because what we would like to ask you is actually your own definition of astrology. I mean, how would you define astrology to a beginner or even to a child?
You know, I'm not sure if I have anything particularly profound to say about that, but I would say it's the study of correlations, mainly. Study of correlations between planetary cycles, subjective experiences, and objective events that serve as vehicles and catalysts for a developmental process.
Okay. And how did you discover astrology? Has there been an event, book, or encounter in your life that made you realize that you needed to study astrology?
Well, my first experience was when I was about 16. I think I probably, like a lot of people, I just picked up a book. I think it was in the supermarket checkout line, and there was all these books on the various astrological signs. They were little small books that were, you know, summations of personality traits, but, you know, obviously a little bit more than you'd get in a newspaper horoscope column, which was the only exposure that I'd had to astrology up until that point. And, you know, I was only 16, and you know, at that age, you're naturally struggling to define yourself as your own person, you know, somebody separate from your family, and who am I and how do I fit in, and what are my strengths and weaknesses and characteristics and so forth. And this little book on astrology, no, well, it wasn't on astrology, it was really just on my sun sign, and that's all it was, just a sun sign. Now, I don't know, maybe it was 30 pages or so, which I suppose is quite a bit, you know, to write on a sun sign, but it just knocked me out. It was so accurate. I felt for the first time that I was hearing myself described objectively that matched how I felt internally. And I remember the main feeling I had about it was, how could something so important and so obviously true not be taught in schools? I mean, for however many years at that point, 10 years or so, I'd been in school. And, you know, nobody ever talked about astrology. And here was something that just, I thought, had more emotional impact and resonance and usefulness in terms of my being able to accept and truly understand who I naturally was than anything I'd ever encountered. So I had to continue with my normal studies and didn't have a whole lot of time to devote to astrology. But when I got out of college, that first summer after graduating with my bachelor's degree, one of the first things I jumped into and started to study more thoroughly was astrology. I'd been studying it a little bit here and there and comparing my understanding of my friends and family members to their sun sign, and, you know, so learning about other signs as well as my own. But I didn't really get into it until I was about 21, 22. And then it just took off. I mean, self-evident validity of it and the usefulness of it as a way of understanding personality. And ultimately, as I got into psychology, a way of working with people and counseling was just obvious. And, you know, I've never looked back.
That's it. All right, my turn now. I would like you to explain to us the concept behind astropsychology, which would be the combination, or rather the interrelatedness of psychology and astrology, since, as we all know, astrology serves as a diagnostic and prognostic tool. Was this a natural and immediate evolution of your psychotherapeutic practice? How did it all begin?
Well, I mean, it's a huge question. You know, you could write a whole book on that question.
Yeah, it's a difficult one.
Yeah, yeah. I'll try to take that one at a time. No, I think that, you know, there's astrology and there's all kinds of different astrologies, traditional astrology and that sort of, and, you know, and even that has various subtypes with Hellenistic and medieval and so forth. But I think the thing that differentiates psychological astrology from what I would call, generally speaking, traditional astrology is its focus on how the planets and all the symbolism of the chart, signs, planets, aspects, significators, dispositors, represent the internal psychological makeup of the individual. And that gets into some really complex territory. You know, how to define, for example, in my own system, I define signs in part as psychological needs, as well as affect states, developmental stages, a set of behavioral traits, planets as psychological functions, certain ways of acting. And so there's this internal dimension that has mainly to do with psychological needs, feelings, psychological functions, intrapsychic conflict, psychological defenses, ways of resolving those intrapsychic conflicts, the process of integration, how planetary aspects can symbolize cognitive structures or core beliefs, internal narratives that the individual operates from and that determine their behavior. But that's just the internal world. The external world, and to some extent, in the 20th century, when psychological astrology first began, it was almost a reaction against the overly event-oriented external focus of traditional astrology. And so psychological astrologers de-emphasized the outer world and the predictive dimension of astrology. And I think it was a natural compensatory kind of movement, but it left out the significance of events. So in my own work, I try to, my main focus and interest is emphasizing not merely the internal world, but how the internal world is synchronistically mirrored by external circumstances, and how events are inputs. They not only mirror, but they also serve as a catalyst and a vehicle for a certain kind of developmental or evolutionary process. You know, they stimulate reevaluation of, let's say, dysfunctional ideas that are counterproductive or that are untrue or lack validity or are partially true or are serving as a defense and impede and impair people's capacity from fulfilling their needs and actualizing their potential and continuing their growth and so forth. So the outer world is really, really important, and what's happening has tremendous significance, but not as something merely to be predicted for its own sake, to be able to, you know, tell people what's going to happen and then presume a position of advising them what to do and when to do it and how to avoid difficult times and, you know, minimize their suffering and so forth, which has really been the focus in traditional astrology. In astropsychology, we think of the event really as a necessary challenge, no matter how difficult or trying it might be. And the focus is on understanding its meaning, its purpose, in, again, serving as a catalyst or a vehicle for deepening self-understanding and insight and resolving internal conflicts and actualizing potential and so forth. So that subjective-objective circular process between inner and outer, which Jung defined largely in terms of synchronicity, but in astropsychology, we think of it as an ongoing, continuous, ever-present process. The internal world being mirrored by the external world, and this circular process constantly unfolding in a way that facilitates the further evolution of the psyche. So that's, in a nutshell, how I think about psychological astrology.
Very simple, isn't it? Well, it's actually quite complex. Was it difficult at first?
No, because I was ignorant of how complex it was. When you're, at least for me, when I'm first starting out, I'm so excited by what I'm learning, even though what I'm learning is, in the beginning, was maybe at a fairly simple and superficial level. It still was powerful and exciting. And then, as I continued to study psychology, and I went to graduate school, and I got my MA, and then I got my PhD, and I was always taking courses and comparing what I was learning to astrology and seeing where they might fit together and how they fit together. And so that marriage between psychology and astrology has been ongoing for, about 35 years now. And it just keeps evolving, my understanding of how it works. I say that astrology is the gift that keeps on giving in a good way, because I think it's one of those fields, and I'm sure there's others, but I think astrology is fairly unique in that you can never stop learning about it. And I don't mean in a broad sense, in the sense of learning all these different techniques and asteroids and all the different methods that astrologers constantly are inventing to, get into the chart. But just looking at the signs and planets and houses and aspects, your basic understanding of those fundamental parts. In my experience, my understanding of how all that works together never stops deepening. And in that sense, it's always been exciting and fulfilling. So, yeah.
Very interesting.
And are there any other interests, theories, or disciplines that you would say have influenced your astropsychology?
Yeah, I mean, as I was just kind of indicating, I'm very eclectic in the way that I incorporate psychology into astrology. My astrology, in some ways, is pretty simple. I mean, it's complex, but it's simple in that I keep it as pure as I can. I don't get into asteroids and a bunch of other things that I think are not essential. I just focus on planets and signs and houses and aspect, and then significators and dispositors. But in that, there's a world of meaning, as I say, that continues to evolve. And every time I'd come across a new psychological theory, not necessarily new in the world, but new to me because I hadn't studied it before, developmental psychology, developmental models and theories, psychodynamic personality theories, going back to Freud and then evolving out of that into object relations theory and control mastery theory and general psychodynamic approach, humanistic transpersonal psychology, narrative psychology, and then probably the most important one, I think, that fits with astrology and fleshes it out in a way that no other psychological model that I've come across does, is general systems theory, which is not really limited to psychology, which is implicit in its name, general systems theory, which is the idea that a system is a set of interacting units, an ordered set of interacting units, in which the whole system is greater than the sum of its parts. And we sort of immediately recognize that as astrological, right? You know, the synergistic approach to the chart, that we're really trying to understand how everything in the chart works together as a system. But in systems theory, a system is always open to its outside environment. In fact, the environment is not really, at least in some models, defined as entirely separate from the system. See, that the system and its environment constitute a kind of unit that interacts. So the system has a permeable boundary, it's open to the outside, and it's always exchanging matter, information, energy. General systems theory started in biology, and then it became applicable, a kind of cross-disciplinary model that could be applied to virtually any system of knowledge, including, of course, psychology. So if you think about the astrological chart as an open system, it's open to its environment, meaning it's taking in information that really is self-generated and created by the nature of the system itself. So what's inside and what's outside are not really absolutely separate. They're a match. It's like a hand and a glove. And in systems theory, they call this organizational closure, in which the living open system includes its relations with an outside environment. And so again, there's this circular causality and feedback loops, which I think when we start to apply that to our understanding of the astrological chart, it gets really, really cool. Because everything in the chart has a dual meaning, subjective and objective, right? I mean, every symbol in the chart represents something psychological inside the person, and it also represents something outside, an event, a character, an environment, a thing, a person, place, etc. And to see how those things relate and interact, that's what I think is most exciting and ultimately of greatest value.
Yes, I think so too. And your well-known expertise led you to travel across the world for seminars, lectures, and let's not forget that you are also adjunct faculty at Nodor Academy in China and at Astroart Astrology School in Turkey. Thanks to all these.
I'm not teaching at owner school right now, but I have, you know, so that was really a cool experience.
And actually, thanks to all these experiences, we were wondering if you have ever noticed differences or similarities on how cultures perceive or interact with astrology.
Yeah, definitely. You know, I do a lot of work in China, and that's a school I'm almost constantly teaching my Chinese students. And an interest in psychological astrology has just exploded in China. I mean, it's just remarkable. I have over 100 students in a class at any one time. And up until maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and this is largely due to the work of David Rayleigh and a woman named Felicia over there that he works with. They're partners in starting this school, Nodor Academy. And the Chinese culture was very, very traditional, which is, you know, true in a lot of different places in the world, South America as well, of course, India. Less so in Europe. Europe is way, way, way more sophisticated in terms of its astrology because it's been doing astrology for so long. Same with America. But a sort of a lack of psychological thinking and exposure to psychology is more characteristic of other countries. And but when they're introduced to it, you know, then it just, all of a sudden, it's like the missing piece, and it opens up a whole new world of understanding. You know, that's been fun to be part of.
Yes. And to conclude, this in fact is our last question. During the conference of June, you will make a speech about the chronicity and the developmental age method. Would you like to briefly illustrate or to give our audience some key points of what this consists in?
Yeah, it's, this is probably the thing that I'm most excited about and passionate about right now.
Wow, wonderful.
It feels new. I mean, it is new. And I could get into how it started, but I mean, briefly, I remember my own teacher, Richard Eidman, back in the 70s and 80s, and he sort of almost as a throwaway line would refer to certain signs in terms of developmental stages that seem to correlate to those signs. But he never really developed his thinking in that area, to any significant degree. He would talk about areas, for example, as the psychology of the infant. He didn't even put it in that way. He just made some connections between infant behavior and Aries. And then, that Pisces was sort of like the final later stage. And to tell you the truth, I don't remember how much he said about other signs, but it got me thinking. And I began to notice that, especially when I studied developmental psychology and the different lifespan developmental models developed by people like Piaget and Jean Piaget out of France and Erik Erikson in the United States, and of course Freud to a lesser extent. And there's been others, but those are two of the main ones. And as I was studying these developmental stages, they weren't exactly 12, but I could see connections between these stages and the signs of the zodiac. And I started to work out what the ages were that each sign seemed to correspond to. And I mean, it took a long time. I started doing this back in the late 80s and then through the 90s. And I didn't write about it or anything, but I just kept looking at at charts of my clients. And I noticed that the houses correspond in meaning and duration to the signs that they correspond to. So for example, the first stage, Aries stage, corresponds to the first 2 years of life. And then gradually it became clear to me that every sign stage after that is 1 year longer than the sign stage before it. So Taurus is a 3-year period, and Gemini is a 4-year period from 5 to 9, and Cancer is a 5-year period from 9 to 14, and so forth. And that experiences that clients were having in these house stages, like for example, the Gemini stage, I look in, this one woman that was memorable had Venus conjunct Pluto squaring Saturn in Scorpio in the 6th house. Venus and Pluto were in the 3rd house in Leo, forming this square to Saturn. And it's falling about 2/3 of the way into the 3rd house, which was about 7.5 to 8 years old. There's ways of working this out very specifically. But when she was exactly that age, she had an accident when she was playing in a kind of Leo game with her friend, her best friend, who pushed her, and she was impaled on this railing, and it pierced her kidney, which is ruled by Venus in medical astrology. Pluto being a wound, a violation, a penetration. And I thought, wow, what are the odds of that, happening precisely at that age, and Venus and Pluto being exactly there? And over time, I noticed hundreds, I mean, just every chart, I see these kinds of correlations now. And most importantly, since Venus and Pluto are squaring, forming an aspect to Saturn, when the individual, this woman, got to the age that Saturn signified in the 6th house, which was about 22 years old, the 6th house correlating to the period from 20 to 27, the beginning of the 7th house, 27 years of age. When she was 22 and she hit that Saturn point, she married a physician. And the physician clearly was sort of a Saturn Scorpio figure, Scorpio having a lot to do with the medical profession, Saturn being a kind of authoritative figure. The guy she married turned out to be, how can I describe it? He was really sexually disturbed, and in a way that exactly paralleled her experience at 7.5 years old when she was in the hospital for a year, and she was molested by the doctor that had performed the surgery on her and continued checking his surgery and would go into her room and she's all medicated. And later he was prosecuted and he had his license revoked, and so it was really clear that he had done this to many of his patients. It wasn't something she just imagined. But when she got to that Saturn experience, she married somebody who was into S&M, sadomasochistic sex, and she didn't know this, but he wanted to bind her up and tie her and dominate her in the same way that she was helpless and strapped into her hospital bed and being molested by the physician when she was 7 years old. So the obvious connection between the experience at 7 and 8 and the experience that she had when she was 22 and realized that the person that she had married, and how she had an opportunity at 22 to say to her husband and do with her husband, that is say no and distance herself and take back her power and find a way to confront her molester by proxy through her husband, and to say and do with him what she couldn't do at 7 and 8 with the physician that had molested her. So that's what we call diachronicity, a meaningful coincidence between events from different life stages that are expressions of the same planetary aspect. See, so if houses represent maturational developmental stages of specific duration, and planets in those houses represent when that planetary process will be most acute, see, it's like a turning point, then the aspects between those planets that form the aspect show connections between planetary age points. In this case, a connection between age 7.5 or 7 to 8 and age 22 to 23. So that the traumatic experience from the earlier developmental stage is recreated in some analogous form at a later stage in order to be solved or healed by virtue of a higher level, later stage, more mature perspective. See, so I just think that's amazing that we can see these resonances between events from one stage to another that correlate to the same aspect.
Yes, it's really fascinating to me, really. And so thank you, Mr. Perry, for your time. It's been fascinating and you gave us so much to think about. So we look forward to welcoming you again on the 14th of June. That is the day of the conference organized by Medio Cielo.
Well, thank you. It's been fun, and I appreciate, I'm grateful for being invited and look forward to participating.
Thank you again. It's a pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye for now.